said, as a boy growing up, he was deeply impressed by the argument for the existence of God that was based upon the need for a first cause, based upon the law of causality. And so, as a young boy, he embraced the idea of the existence of God, until he read an essay written by the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who raised this basic objection against causal thinking. Mill said it this way: if everything requires a cause, then manifestly God would require a cause, and whoever caused God would require a cause, so that you can't reason back to God on the basis of the principle that everything must have a cause. Now, when Bertrand Russell read that essay at age 17, he said it was an epiphany for him, and he realized that the law of cause and effect would not lead you to the conclusion of a first cause, but would lead you on an endless regress that would get you, in the final analysis, not to God, but nowhere. And so he, therefore, denied the utility of arguing for the existence of God on the basis of the law of cause and effect. Now, let me just respond to that very briefly and very simply, that here's one of those classic examples where Homer nods. John Stuart Mill was unarguably a brilliant philosopher, very well trained in logic and skilled in analytical thought and cognition, who made a fundamental, foundational error in his thinking with respect to causality. The primary error was an error in definition. He assumed that the definition of the law of causality is simply everything must have a cause. Now, if that indeed were the classical law of causality, then his criticism of causal reasoning back to a first cause would be valid. Let me put it in simple terms. I heard the story of two little boys that were having a discussion. And the first little boy said to the second little boy, "Where did the trees come from?" And his friend said, "God made the trees." And then he said, "Well, where did the flowers come from?" And his friend said, "God made the flowers." And his friend said, "Well, where did you come from?" And he said, "God made me." And then his buddy said, "Well, who made God?" And his partner said, "God made himself." Now, I remember also my mother telling me that when I was about 3 years old, I asked our minister, "Who made God?" And my minister was super impressed by that and told my mother, "You know, you have a child prodigy on your hands here, and this boy is going to grow up to be a theologian or a philosopher or something like that." And my mother was fond of telling me that when I was pursuing a career in theology. She said, "I always knew you were going to do that because the minister told us that when you were 3 years old." And I said, "Mom, let me tell you something." She said, "What?" I said, "Every 3-year-old kid asks that question. Where does God come from?" I mean, that's as normal a question as any child can ever ask. It doesn't show any particular insight on my part at 3 years old or at 10 years old. I said, however, we somehow stop and say, "Boy, that little kid is profound when he says, who made God?" And he says, "God made himself." No, 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 no. Even God can't make himself. And the point is, we don't have to have an antecedent cause for God. God, as Aristotle rightly understood, is an uncaused cause. And you don't have to provide a cause for an eternal being, as we will see in the course of this study. But just now, by way of shorthand, let me just say that the error is in the definition. The law of causality has never said that everything has to have a cause. Rather, the law of causality, stated properly, says every effect must have an antecedent cause. Every effect must have an antecedent cause. Now, had John Stuart Mill been working with that definition of causality, he would never have gotten himself into the mess he did and never would have led Bertrand Russell astray into that morass of confusion, which, by the way, that principle that Bertrand Russell, as brilliant as he was, adopted at age 17, he maintained till the day he died. That error continued in his thinking, because the definition of the law of causality, again, is not that everything must have an effect, because if everything had to have an effect, had to have a cause, God indeed would have to have a cause. But the law simply says every effect must have a cause. And if we could find something that is not an effect, that is something that has the power of being within itself and is from eternity, obviously that being would not be an effect. And when we define the character of God, we say that God is a self-existing, eternal being who is independent, underived, not contingent, but he's eternal. He is not caused because he is not an effect. Only things that are made are effects.